So you start to deepen that contrast and get those effects of light against dark, dark against light as you mass in your space tone around and behind the glass. Okay, then finally what typically would have to happen next would be that we would need to see some of that color, that space tone color, being observed right through the glass. So I'm just going to take the side of my charcoal stick and start to swipe in a little bit deeper color back there in the background so that it looks like we can see some of that darker color from the space tone peeking through the glass in the fishbowl. Okay, in here, there's going to be some shadows, some highlights. It's going to be darker. Just talked about this previously, but sometimes just stroking the edge of complicated textures like the glass or the metal is a good place to start. So I'm going to take my my blending stick or my eraser and just kind of start to indicate so that there's more activity, more stuff happening there at the edge. It gives it a little more interest and gives the artist a little bit of more material to work with and to develop. So we're starting to get some pretty good effects here, feeling like we can actually see into that fishbowl. That's what I want. This is just a charcoal pencil. I can use this to kind of, smaller shapes. It's basically the same thing as your 6B. Something else very important for me here when I'm looking at your art, when I'm grading, is what's going on here in this cast shadow system. And what I'm looking for is the ability to see value variation inside of these color changes. So I want to be able to see depth inside of the darks. I don't want the shadow to just be smooth and even, but I want there to be a notable change in the color of the stripe as it goes from light stripe and shadow to dark stripe and shadow. So that's a good visual effect for you to understand how to capture. It requires transparency. You can see I'm having to go back and forth also using a couple of sharp tools and work on all these little new shapes that are emerging inside of that shadow. Again, this idea is called value variation. In your darks. It's definitely one of those keys I'll be looking for when I grade your assignments. Is were you able to capture the effects of the shadow and the light on the different colors of cloth. It's just a blending stick. I'm using that to smooth out some of these colors that are a little too much texture in them. The general rule, you're going to probably be blending stuff with your blending stick that's going away from your eye. It's in the background, so things that are further away is just a physical phenomenon that, if you push something into your paper or your canvas, it's going to look like it's going away from you. Alright, so what's going on here with this metal? Well, the first step is typically I'm going to make sure I have some line art that I like, and here I'm using a charcoal pencil just to kind of tune this shape up a little bit, and also because some of the details in the metal are a little bit small. But as I said before, it's going to be a direct reflection of the world around it, basically. So if I have some kind of ball here, then I'm going to see some kind of echo or shape of that inside of the metal form. Now, so my advice here is that you make it up a little bit, and you make sure that when you're drawing, that your viewer understands what it is in the reflection that you're representing. So it's kind of the reflection itself is highly symbolic and can give the viewer a lot of clues about what it is in the real world that's making that reflection. So I'm going to add some of these stripes in here. And I'm using a fair amount of imagination, but I know that it's going to have a different effect or a different look, whereas the stripes in the glass might be a little bit wobbly and have kind of a transparent look. The stripes in the metal are going to be much more clear and concrete. Again, it's just a mirror, it's a direct reflection of the things that are going on around you, and it will just reflect the curvature of the surface. Definitely going to be seeing some bright shiny highlights there on some of these top planes. Alright, well there it is. I'm going to take a little chunk here of 6B charcoal, start to mass in some of the values on the inside of the metal. I just used a pencil, a little bit of variation, but pretty much the same thing. I'm just developing my line, and then I'm going to use my charcoal stick to mass in my planes. A little bit of trial and error here just to kind of get the shapes of these stripes the way that I think they ought to be, because I'm kind of just making this up based on a lot of logic and imagination. And that's the other reason I like this assignment quite a bit is it lets you lie. It lets you learn to invent. I say lie, but it's kind of a joke. You're learning to express yourself. You're learning to describe what's there. And what I mean by lying is that you're enhancing somehow. It's not just dirty smudges, but you're actually trying to depict or trying to draw something so that it becomes more clear for the person who's looking at it. That's what I think artists are supposed to be doing, is describing what they see and kind of stepping back and looking carefully and making observations about the world around them. So I'm just using a blending stick and a charcoal pencil and a charcoal stick, a couple different erasers to kind of shape and sculpt the charcoal so that it starts to reveal form. It's a kind of a fluid thing. It starts out as a bunch of lines, and then you sort of glaze it in or mass it in, and then you're able to glaze it, and it softens up and it becomes something that's sort of pliable, a bit like having a little lump of clay or something that you can move around and sculpt. And that's one of the beauties of charcoal, is that it is so plastic and movable. And it lets you do a number of things, including observe, but you can also use it to create, to invent things that aren't really there as well once you learn some things about the rules. Alright, so this metal looks too light to me, so I know metal needs kind of a dark base color, so I'm going to scribble a little bit of extra charcoal right over the top of everything on the inside, and that's kind of a common thing that I have to do a lot when I'm drawing these two textures, is I have to scribble over the tops of things I've already drawn. So, everybody knows about coloring on the inside of lines, but you didn't maybe know that coloring outside of lines is a skill too. That if you're trying to do something from scratch, to do it by hand, to build an illusion, you have to understand that there's going to be times when you do need to actually color outside of the lines to help to weave together the textures and the fabric of a piece. Something else here, maybe you never really thought about it, but occasionally you have to get a smaller shape. You have to be able to color in between your highlights. I have some highlights down here on this plane that's kind of facing up. Even though something's low on the object, it might still be facing up and get a lot of light on it. So you want to be aware of that. Here's a solid. It should be kind of an old skill at this point to put light and shadow on a ball, but you guys are all beginners. So, and remember what I'm doing here is I'm separating the top from the bottom, or the light from the shadow. Starting to look for things like highlights and cores. And then I've got a cast shadow system here that I've been constructing underneath of these two objects that I need to bring into a little more focus. Okay, that's going to clean up a lot once I get the rest of this space tone masked in. So again, just to review, if you can't reach something in your drawing, especially when you're going to do your background, just turn your paper a little so that you can get the charcoal stick right up to the outline of the object. Then you're just going to pull and swipe, and it's called cutting in. What I'm doing is forcing a nice sharp clean edge right up against the outline of the object, and then the edge that's on the outside of the form is nice and soft and blendable, and I can swipe that right down into the background color and blend it away, so you get this beautiful contrast of having a nice clean sharp looking outline around something, and then also be able to blend that away into your space tone. So, and then these big horizontal swipes like that are kind of fluid, I'm doing that on purpose. I like how it looks. You can emulate it. I think that horizontal strokes tend to work better in backgrounds. This is just a little piece of paper towel. I'm going to glaze here. Newsprint doesn't take as much glazing, just barely touching that really. And then I want to move on to a couple other quick steps in this process here. I'm going to get an eraser, a couple erasers, and start to lift some of the lighting effects out of these forms again. So when you go to lift light, what you typically want to do is start in at the brightest light. Start at your highlights and work your way out. Ultimately, what I also have in mind here is that I'm going to be using a little bit of the white charcoal to brighten up some of these final highlights at the end. So in addition to just trying to draw these objects, I'm also trying to demonstrate a series of steps or sequence that you should go through when you use your charcoal sticks. So that's all been so far 6B General's charcoal and my eraser, my chamois, whatever I needed to blend. But now I'm going to move on to my next charcoal stick, which is my Conti Black, and I'm going to start to use a black Conti just to kind of darken up. What I'm going to do now is kind of alternate between a black and white Conti, and use the black to start to pick out some cores and maybe work on the transitions in the space tone. I have these things loaded into chalk holders, but you can also use it as just a charcoal stick. But Conti, the black Conti, C-O-N-T-E, the accent on it, 2B black, that's going to go in your cores and your space tone. And how much time and how long you spend on each phase or sequence of the process starts to become opinion, and it takes experience, and sometimes it's deceptive. It's like how long I'm spending on something because I might be talking, but I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes just a little bit might be all that you need. You're just going to swipe it in at rim cores, sit cores, form cores, work a little bit of that Conti down into your space tone, and you can be very careful with it, or you can be a little bit more loose with it. The point is that I'm distributing it across the surface of the drawing in a fairly even way that is letting me kind of develop things in a systematic manner. I'm going through all the objects and putting 6B on it, and then I'm going to go through all the objects and put the Conti on it, etc. So you kind of get a work order, a flow of operations together for yourself. So then after Conti, you'll probably want to blend. You can wipe at it with a paper towel. Just glazing it down a little bit, pushing it into the surface, not trying to change things too much, but get rid of some of the loose, powdery stuff on paper. Okay, that's just a pink pearl, pink eraser. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to lift out some of the lit planes, some of the lighted areas. One more time, it just happens. You have to clean it up a few times in charcoal as you're working. But that's a good thing ultimately, because what it's really doing is it's helping you find the values you want and need. Okay, so that was black Conti, did a little erasing. Now I'm going to go at it, actually, prior to adding my white highlights, I have one more dark that I'm going to add here. This is my Heritage Black, very bold. Same thing, honestly, it's just cores and space tone, but it's It's just one more kind of level of gray that you can use to blend in. And one thing I usually typically do with the Heritage is I do a little bit of finger blending. Pushing some of those notes in fairly deep into the surface, darkening that space tone and any deep shadows or deep areas of refraction on glass may also need something almost black. So I'm just going around hitting some of those places where I would expect to see even a little more darkness, cores, space tone. I'm also kind of working on a little bit of line quality, adding dynamics all throughout. I'll be adding dynamics with every charcoal that I'm using, so I'm working on not just massing but also sort of developing what is outline, and working on lost and found outlines, sometimes making my outlines more bold, other times getting rid of them and letting them dissolve into the values around. Just a pink pearl here. I'm just cutting in lights around the edges and in various places where I think stuff looks like it's a little too dark or needs to be brightened up. You're going to be looking at your subject matter, and you can apply some of these basic principles to very complex things. So I should have left it just a tiny bit more room here, but I think I can squeeze this in. And this happens a lot where you have things that have a stripe on them and then they go around a corner. What's going to have to happen here, I'm going to just wipe this off real quick. That's just a sham. What if I wanted to have a table here, a plane change? I could change the direction of my stripes and start to mass in a plane change here at the front of my drawing. This was just 6B. Went back to 6B. If I need to, it's okay. Sometimes going back, grab another little bit of 6B at the end. The first charcoal you started with is kind of a legitimate thing. Okay, ready for some highlights. I've got my white Conti here. And the trick with the highlights is you want to make sure that wherever you're going to put that, which is usually just in your top plane shiny highlights, make sure you clean off real good where you're going to lay down that white charcoal. Otherwise it's going to get kind of smudgy looking and has a tiny bit of a weird bluish tint, which is a bit unappealing. So again, what you want to do, the rule with the white is it shouldn't really touch or mix in with the charcoal underneath of it. You want to keep those two colors actually physically pretty separate, and what you're doing is you're going to separate those colors with the color of the paper, or and not attempt to use the white as a kind of a blendable thing. You want to keep it fairly fresh and localized, and not let it mix in with the colors around it. So again, want to use white chalk? Great. Do it at the end and keep it nice and clean and localized, and just kind of isolate it right there in the top plane highlights where you have the brightest, shiniest highlights. And if you can get a highlight shape or a highlight color from just erasing and not using the white, that's also a good strategy. Is don't overuse the white. What we're really doing here with the white is using it as a kind of design element It's intended to create an effect, an illusionistic effect, but it also is creating a kind of trickery, because it's really drawing your focus to wherever you put it. So if you put too much of it there, it's gonna kind of water down the overall effect. Anyway, so that's the end of the drawing, and a lot of stuff here. But a couple things that are priorities. One, we're talking about texture. Textures of glass, textures of metal, textures of solids and patterns. But we're also talking about order of operations for your charcoal layering, what charcoal to start with, what charcoal to finish with. Quickly write that down one more time here at the very bottom of the sheet, and then I'll call it good. So I'm usually going to start with a 6B generals. Then that moves to Conti. 2B. That's going to move to pencils. Then heritage. Finally, we finish with the white. Whoops. Alright, well, glass, transparency, reflection, refraction. Metal, you got a lot of stuff here, but it's going to have direct reflections following the curvature of the surface. Solid has light and shadow on it. Pattern has sharp edges. Finally, just one little quick reminder here about glass. Light against dark, dark against light. Alright guys, thank you, and hope you enjoyed.